Hello everyone, this is update for February 23, 2023, but in reality it's kind of like catch-up update for this past 7 or 8 days that I had my personal time off, and this is all update for days 300. This is days 365 of the war, end of the date update. I'm gonna start with strategic news and events. There were a lot of those over these days. I'm not really going to focus on the speech of the Russian president. There's nothing sort of new there. I hope everyone who has been following the channel is very clear. This is the war between West and loose alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and a couple more countries that want to change the existing world order in their favor. And that's really the essence of it. From a Russian perspective, this is kind of like desire to change the outcome, the loss in the Cold War that was sort of finalized in 1991, started really 1989, was finalized in 81. So then this is basically attempt to sort of roll back some of those changes. That's just from Russian perspective, plus obviously desire to have this energy experts and use them as a tool for to influence the world. But again, the only important part from the Russian president speech is that every soldier will have now 14-day leave for every 6 months of the military duty on the front line. This really also means that there is long-term planning on the Russian side, that this war is, or expectation of the Russian political military top is that this war is not going to be over soon. And sort of now you hear many sides saying, okay, this war will last forever. I would not forever, but like for a couple of years. Someone say a year, someone two, and so on. I would say that both countries are getting to the exhaustion point. It's not sort of achieved yet, but they're getting there, and they're getting much closer to it. I think in the 6 to 9 months period, both countries will get into critical situation where internally they will be completely exhausted of their resources. Now I'm not talking about what we call money, because that's a credit can always be sort of created, but the real resources they cannot be created. By resources I also mean people. And in Ukraine, there's already very clear feeling of exhaustion in terms of the people who willing to go to army and fight. It gets to the point that this military conscription service is catching people on the streets. So that's just obviously doesn't bode well for the army, for Ukrainian army, in terms of its ability to fight. And that's why I mentioned, long time ago, from the very beginning, that losing those people who are willing to fight is the biggest mistake and biggest crime for Ukraine's ability for its own self-defense. And that's why that responsibility lies with Ukrainian military and political top, including Ukrainian president and head of Ukrainian army. And that damage that they are doing is irreparable, unfortunately. So that creates potential for big disappointment. Not sure when, maybe 5, 6, 7 months. We'll see how quickly that happens. Similar situation is happening in Russia. Um, the unfortunate problem for Ukraine is that Russia is, let's say, 3.5 to 4 times larger than Ukraine. So it can outlast Ukraine just from that perspective. But as I said before, both countries are going to their 1917 moments. Um, if you're rationally saying it should happen sooner in Ukraine than in Russia, but there's always chance it's possible it happens in Russia sooner than Ukraine. You can never predict those things in general. So this is sort of a concerning speech of the Russian president. Then there were, you probably seen meetings between China and U.S. minister, basically equivalent ministers of foreign affairs. Uh, just confirmed that both countries are firmly on the collision course, and uh, no talking will change that collision course, because this is objective reality, objective forces that are stronger than, empty talks that's being attempted during those meetings. You cannot change economy. You cannot change the course of the forces that are being in place, more so in China than in the U.S. Then next important. So let's just look a little bit now into the future. What's happening? What's coming up? So first on February 26th, 28, there will be meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, and basically this meeting is another important milestone in cementing power of current Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is seen to, he's probably will install his own proteges as prime minister, vice prime minister, head of judicial power, had all of basically this is going to be sort of kind of like a trickle down effect where he's going to be installing his own puppets throughout the entire system. So system is completely controllable and basically under full control at that point. This is very similar, by the way, looks very similar how Stalin was coming into the power in the Soviet Union, starting from, let's say, really late 20s, early, well, let's say really late, like 28, 1928, 29, 30 in the Soviet Union, and maybe even like early 30s, because it took him a little bit long to cleanse the opponents in the Communist Party at that time. This is happening much faster in China. Also, Chinese president installed already his own people in the Central Bank of China. I think there are two vice presidents there, so not the head of the central bank, but it's essentially they will be sort of controlling and implementing his desires in central bank. So he's basically kind of like capturing key centers of power in general in state to be able to fully control it. So basically, like centralized, really centralized power in sort of one hands. Then related to this is he's going to give a speech or proposal, peace proposal on Ukraine tomorrow on February 24th. It's very clear it's going to be completely unfavorable and unacceptable for Ukraine. He's just basically, supporting Russia and its ally and so on. So there won't be any surprises. But that will create, because it's going to be probably rejected, cannot say for sure because anything can happen just from that perspective. I'm not saying it's going to be rejected, but that will create even bigger sort of rift, and that probably will be a trigger for China to be able to to do more to support Russia more in its war effort. Um, I will get back to that because we'll have a little bit, um, you know, deeper conversation on the shell hunger and shell shortages in both Ukraine and um, Russia, and so we'll discuss how China may help in general with that. Then another news out of China: there is new law coming into effect on March 1 this year that basically institutes conscription service or reservist service, where people like general population will be going through some kind of like military preparation. I know all of the details, like what percentage, because obviously you don't need everyone. It's way too many, let's put this way. That law was passed in, just to give you how quickly everything happens, in December 2022, and obviously the law like that is being passed when you prepare for the war. It doesn't get passed in when you're really seeking peace and so on. So it's a clear war sort of effort, war preparation happening in China. On related topic, there was some statistical information that Chinese shipbuilding yards are essentially dominating world, producing, I think, between 50 to 70% of all of the ships, commercial ships I'm talking about. So the importance of that translates into ability to build military ships, and sort of basically the world is basically the world is paying for creation of the Chinese naval force, basically, because that subsidizes, because it's kind of like a dual purpose tool, and that's really subsidizes Chinese naval military efforts. So the result kind of shows up already right now. So China has 340 military ships. US has less than 300. Not to mention that Chinese are concentrated there, and US has spread them out throughout the entire world. And in a couple of years, China will have 400. So, I'm not, I don't have all of the details in terms of the quality, because quality does matter. There's no question about it. And let's assume quality is slightly less. It's already sort of comparable force. It's where you have a fighting chance. May not be the winning force, but there is a fighting chance where the blow to U.S. Navy will be extremely, if not fatal, will be such that it effectively will be a Pyrrhic victory for the U.S., where they will not be able to recover from such victory, and essentially will lose its power. So as you can see, things are sort of stars are aligning slowly but surely. Then there is news out of Taiwan, where it's what I mentioned before, that China essentially has Taiwan in its pocket without even shooting anything. The Kuomintang, the party that used to be actually fighting communists, is leading in the polls in Taiwan, and which means and Kuomintang wants to reunite, basically become back part of China, whatever you want to, whatever the proper way, basically. But which again goes back to the whole idea of Taiwan fighting China. It's in a way moot point, because if more than half of population there not willing to fight in very clear way, and the army is not going to be fighting, it has to come from population. and there's not enough support to really have any meaningful fight or meaningful chance of winning. Not to mention that there are multiple reports that Taiwanese military is dominated by sort of representatives from Kuomintang. So essentially, they will just surrender, and that's it. So this is going back to what I said before, that if there's no invasion, China will get it in a very peaceful way, which is very kind of like Sun Tzu type of strategy. Excellent, I would say, excellent strategy in this way to get what you want without really fighting. If there is a fight, the fight will not be long, because Taiwanese military will fall pretty quickly and Taiwanese society will fall pretty quickly. Maybe there will be some pockets, but essentially, I would say Taiwan is lost for all intents and purposes. Unless US wants to really head-to-head fight there, I don't know, possible. Really, the front line is really going to be Philippines, and so just this is where looks like the situation, what's going on there basically. Now let's switch a little bit to Russia and Russian energy exports in China. So situation, with Russian natural gas, I mentioned this before, is terrible for Russia because essentially it's blocked. They exporting very little of it. Prices are going down because part of the reason is economies, the world economy is going into recession and demand for energy is going down. And natural gas is not sort of the most ideal energy commodity because it's gas, it's not liquid. So it's always inferior to crude oil and let's say other or any or coal. So the prices are going down there sort of faster than sort of in those key commodities. However, Russia has exported 15.5 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China in 2022 for the entire year. It plans to increase in the next year or two to 48 billion cubic meters, and then in whatever, I don't know, 5-10 years to 100 billion. So as you can see, the increase in export just on the volume does not cover up losses in export to Europe, not even close. And then if we include the prices, which are like, let's say, $250 per thousand cubic meters, price-wise, they also barely profitable for Russia, if at all profitable. So as you can see, it's sort of strategic dead end for Russian natural gas industry, for Gazprom essentially. There's no really bright future there, at least the way prices are right now. Who knows what's going to happen down the road because of the potential war. At the same time, Russia is surviving thanks to the crude oil exports, where the black market is sort of flourishing. People who operate in this black market, really who's getting rich these days, not actually Russian state budget, because you really kind of need to pay for the risk of those people who do this. You've probably seen a lot of news where, these tankers are, transferring crude oil from one to another to hide their origin of the crude oil and so on, to create a sort of artificially non-Russian origin. So that's what's really happening. In terms of China is also importing record amounts of Russian crude, 1.5 million barrels per day. Just a reminder, Russia has been producing 11. Now it went down to 10.5 starting March. So they're reducing their output, and probably they will reduce even more in coming months, next 6 months. So there will be price of oil is definitely going to be supported by the reduction in Russian output. Then there is OPEC reductions, very small on 150,000, but still, all of these producers, they feeling sort of power. They realize that they have control, and they understand that it's more beneficial for them to reduce volume to increase the price. So that's the situation with the crude oil. Oh, and then in addition, uh, what is another favorable factor is there are news that U.S. resumed release of crude oil from its strategic petroleum reserve, so it's going down even further. So this is again, creates this stretch rubber effect that once that SPR is sufficiently depleted, it will really snap back with a strong power, and unless there is economic depression, the price for crude will remain pretty elevated, and that will also create a lot of inflationary effects, which you can see everywhere. Those inflationary effects are not going anywhere, and they will not go anywhere, and interest rates are going to go higher from where they are right now. Will continue, because this is not because of Russia. I'm not saying this is primarily a result of the energy policy in the West, or the failure of the energy policy, and generally policies including like banning combustion engines, in Europe, in where else? Canada, around the world, basically, partially in the U.S. I don't think it's going to happen in the U.S. It's just um, mission impossible. I don't believe it's going to happen in the U.S. anytime. But anyways, all actions by the parliaments, or basically powers in the West, do everything to increase inflation and decrease standards of living in the West. Eventually, that also will snap back, and I would call it the West is itself going for its own 1917 moment. They're just going to be it's much further away, but it's somewhere down the road on the horizon. Now let's switch to more sort of military strategic situation. And what I've been mentioning on the community board is that Russian army in Ukraine right now on the uh, shell diet, um, and Wagner Group was on, I'd say, shell sort of starvation mode, in shell starvation mode. So what's going on is that probably since the end of the 2022, um, Russian military started developing shortages of ammunition, and I'm talking about the shells, artillery shells, and mortar mines. I'm not talking about bullets and all of that. Like Russia has plenty of those. It has many manufacturing facilities, and can produce huge numbers of those. Where there are shortages, as I said, there are only two uh, shell producing plants left in Russia, so everything has been sort of, call it, destroyed by the Putin and by the Russian president and its oligarchs over past whatever 20 years. And so now Russia is facing those actions. That actually, out of those two plants, only one is producing 152 millimeter shells, which are the key sort of bread and butter, what is really needed for both military, for Ukrainian and Russian. Um, so there is an investments in increasing um, sort of production capacity, but it's obviously not going to be enough. The number of shells, the way sort of how Russian military used to operate, it requires enormous amount of shells, similar to World War II production, maybe even higher, maybe World War One production. And that's really impossible without really switching the economy to like totally military camp. And that may happen down the road, but at least it doesn't happen at this moment. There are no actions by the Russian Russian political top that indicated that's going to be done. Um, so, what this really means is that, in a way, it puts Russian military into the strategic dead end as well, because they cannot do what sort of operate how they used to operate, where it just artillery firewall that sort of slowly but surely destroys Ukrainian defenses. This is possible, but on very selected um, and narrow sections of the front line, which also means that capturing territory will take, let's say, years, could be, call it forever, um, which also turns the war into more of a meat grinder. Um, so again, that takes away Russia's military ability to do much. Um, Ukrainian military is already in that position, so there is increase in supply, all of that, but it's not going to be enough as well for Ukrainian military. Just for the reference, I think Ukraine received close to 1 million 155 millimeter shells from the US in all of the 2022. Um, so what happens? So now let's go back to Russian military, because that's sort of more, call it, interesting. Uh, what happens there is there are quite a bit of shortages of artillery shells, and more I'm referring more to 152 millimeter shells because that's the main tool. So what this really means is that most of the section of the front lines, they get pretty much like drops, and to do any like even limited offensive, you really need to accumulate over a long period of time enough shells, so then you kind of create this shell hail for a short period of time in a very narrow section of the front line. That's what actually Russian troops tried to do in Vuhledar, where they failed miserably because it wasn't done well, wasn't done right. So, because Russian military is feeling those shortages, so then what happens? Wagner Group was receiving everything they wanted because they're much smaller and so on. But because there is this political fight between the head of the Wagner Group, Evgeny Prigozhin, and the Russian military top, Russian Minister of Defense, head of the um, headquarters, chief of staff there. Uh, so they just decided to shut it off to Wagner Group and kind of like switch them to the regular Russian military units, basically where receive peanuts. And obviously, uh, Evgeny Prigozhin was not happy, because then he realizes, okay, I cannot operate, I cannot achieve results with that small number of shells. So he started this sort of public political fight as a leverage, as a tool to force to be supplied with enough shells, or with the shells that he used to have. So as of, I think, yesterday, he under all of the he created enough of the pressure in Russia and support actually among many people that resulted in the sort of channeling all of these resources back to him. So the resources are being again supplied to Wagner Group in the amounts that they are requesting. Obviously he uses reason for that is that he can show results versus Russian regular military cannot show any results and only shows failures. And it's extreme contrast, especially for Russian military, political top, and for obvious reasons, resources are being channeled where they're used more efficiently. In some ways, actually, this is very similar how it was in Nazi Germany in the second half of the World War II, where more resources were channeled to the SS units versus the regular German army. And so this is, again, the same. When you don't have enough resources, then you have selective application of resources in enough quantities, but this really means that the whole system is not really working at the same time. You may have sort of local successes, but strategically you kind of losing. This is where the Russian military right now, and that's where China comes in, that I mentioned before. So looks like that speech that Chinese president is going to give tomorrow is going to be so what is going to be excuse for China to supply shells. It may happen through North Korea, basically. North Korea then supply to Russia. Not sure how it's going to be organized. I'm sure it's going to be organized in very sort of covert ways, which is typical for communist parties. And I'd say there's no question Russia is operating as a communist country at large. And obviously China is the same way. And by the way, origins of this communist systems are in mafia, basically. So which is always hiding and doing things undercover. So that's why they operate that way. It's sort of their natural way of operation. And so what I'm going back to what I'm trying to say is more likely than not, this is basically a strategy to say, oh, well, okay, you're not accepting our peace proposal, then our hands are open. You're supporting Ukraine, we're going to be supporting Russia. And that's probably where it's all going. I'm not saying it's 100% decided for sure. We'll see, but there is big sort of incentive or desire in China, call it payback to the West and specifically to the US, in terms of, how to say, making it very difficult for the US to win in Ukraine, or, in China's hopefully make US fail in Ukraine. That will sort of allow them to kill sort of many birds with one shot. First of all, kind of like retaliate for all of those semiconductor limitations or sanctions that China is going through, which creating a lot of problems in China. And then also weaken US if there is a conflict, actually a military conflict around Taiwan. So you kind of kill two birds with one shot. By the way, speaking about this semiconductor manufacturing, there were some other, a couple days ago or 3 or 4 days ago, there were news that a Chinese employee or researcher basically stole all of the know-how from ASML, which is the key manufacturer of lithography equipment, which is used to manufacture equipment to manufacture semiconductors, and he stole all of that and brought it to China. So what this really means, it's just a matter of 2, 3, 4 years before China will have its own lithography industry that's probably going to be slightly worse, but not going to be far behind West. And that's good enough because they can compensate with quantity and that's how they operate. That's how the Soviet Union operated. So that's sort of typical pass for that part of the world. So that's oh, and then just in terms of how many shells are being used by Wagner Group, this is estimation. It's not hard, like 100% correct. It's educated guess. So the educated guess is they using 10.5 thousand 152 millimeter shells per day and 2.5 thousand 120 millimeter shells per day, plus many others, right? But this is, and the total number they use about 20,000, slightly less than 20,000, 18 to 20,000. That include also rockets and everything, but in total, that's about that. But that's the most critical part is those two items because they are just something that's like main tools. 152 millimeter shells and 120 millimeter mortar mines or whatever shells, whatever you want to call them. So uh, again, this is right now the situation is such that both militaries are starved of the shells, and that's basically holds them back. And in a way, it kind of like cools down the conflict and sort of explosiveness of it, and sort of quick results and everything. Um, One more item I would like to mention: there are news in Russia, or I think Russian Minister of Defense is claiming that Ukrainian military is preparing to enter Russian-controlled part of Moldova. This is this white area. This is along the Dniester River, and there is large ammunition depot, like in the area where roughly where I'm showing. That's a couple kilometers from Ukrainian border. So there is a huge price there, and so that's what Russian side is claiming that Ukraine is preparing to do. I would say Ukraine should have done this long time ago. That would have been right move because this is essentially kind of like a leverage in the Moldova and Ukraine that could be potentially used down the road by the Russian military. There are Russian military, there are Russian soldiers there. It's not much of them. I think 3,000 in total. So they definitely cannot defend this territory for sure. And removing sort of potentially a dagger that could go into your back is generally a good idea, especially if you can. And there is a price of that huge uh, ammunition depot from Soviet times, which is, as I said, huge. Potentially, just it's for a short time, it may solve Ukrainian problems as well. So you can kind of kill um, many birds with one shot. I doubt that will happen, uh, but we'll see. If that happens, it actually would be, I would say, totally correct move by Ukrainian military top and Ukrainian political top. Unfortunately, I don't have high hopes of them. Now let's actually do one item is Ukrainian power grid before we jump to the front line. Ukrainian power grid still exists. Um, Actually, there are some improvements in it. Ukraine is actively importing electricity from Europe. So apparently, don't know all of the details, but just from the outcome, I see that the supply of electricity becomes much better, stable. Essentially, no shortages at this point. Which also means that there are some, transformers being supplied, and basically there are power lines being restored. Even sounds impossible because typically transformers takes up to a year to manufacture. They're custom made, but somehow, um, you know, somehow it's being sort of restored and somehow it functions. The part of the reason it functions because essentially industry is dead. So the huge part of the demand died off in unnatural and terrible way. So basically you don't need as much energy in the first place. So that's just probably part of the explanation for it. And then the other one, as I said, is supply of the electrotechnical equipment from the West that allows to supply general population. This also means that there is no economy left. I mentioned this before. I mentioned this probably from, I don't know, from May, that Ukraine essentially has no economy and there's essentially no opportunities for the majority of the people to earn any money at this point in Ukraine. So we'll see that also will not help and will push Ukraine to its 1917 moment. At the same time, Ukrainian state, Ukrainian government is flush with the money from the West. Um, a lot of it is being looted by corrupt Ukrainian government officials, and essentially almost nothing trickles down to actual people. So that's just reality, kind of like on the ground. It's sad reality, but it is what it is. And all of that sort of fight with corruption by Ukrainian president was just a fake show for optical show for the West, just to show that something is being done, but in reality, nothing is being done. Now let's actually do a walk through the front line. There is some escalation along the state border. There are more sort of artillery exchanges by both sides. Really unclear where sort of the reason for it, but so far there's some elevated exchange of artillery fire. Now let's look at the North Lugansk front line. Things here are more or less the same. There are reports that here in this large forest area that Russian troops managed to advance like a couple kilometers, 1 to 2 kilometers. This is not major offensive. This is just basically defensive, local offensive actions. But it's not part of anything major. Apparently, the balance of power slowly shifting to Russian side, and so it shows off basically. But and which also doesn't bode well for the future, right? Because all of this, let's see, conscripts are starting to show up in larger numbers on the front line on the Russian side. Now let's look at North Donbass front line, where things really not going well for Ukraine. So I mentioned this before on the community board. I just mentioned about Paraskovyivka, but at this point, Russian troops advanced even further. They captured Berhivka, which is another key point in the north. They are advancing towards Vasilivka, this village here. And essentially, let's just look. This is the more current map. So as you can see, Berhivka in their hands. They are fighting in Yahidne here. This is another village here in the north of Bahmut. You can see that essentially Ukrainian defensive positions collapsed north of Bahmut, and there is this huge salient here. And as I said before, we are seeing the process of losing Bahmut. There is no question about that it's going to be lost. Even for a little bit, there was help for Ukrainian side because the Wagner Group experienced shortages of the shells. Now the flow back at high level again. Not sure for how long, but at least probably enough to capture Bahmut. And by the way they compensated that lack of lack of shells is that actually we're getting shells from other Russian units in informal ways, basically not through the formal ways. They just conversation with the commanders of other units, and they there is such a strong support within the Russian military of the Wagner Group at the lower level and middle level, that they just give their shells to Wagner Group. That's how they were surviving. Plus, they were, incurring higher, um, you know, human losses. So their attacks led to there was basically they had to use more people, and more soldiers died. More members of the Wagner Group were dying, mercenaries. Well, I don't know if it's mercenaries at this point, but basically more members of it were dying, and so that's how they compensated for the lack of the shells for that time being. For that 4 or 5 days, they didn't have enough of those. And in that time, they managed to actually use, as you can see, they achieved quite a bit. They, at this point, they essentially sealed the fate of Bahmut. It's gonna be lost. It's just a question of, is it gonna be lost in 5 days, 10 days, 14 days? I don't know, but it's definitely much closer. At the same time, as you can see, Ukrainian troops had very local tactical success. They managed to push Wagner mercenaries from this road between Konstantinivka and Bahmut. Doesn't mean that this road is usable. This is not usable. It's just a local tactical success that sort of leads to nowhere. Strategically, Ukrainian side has lost, and this pink line is the main supply route. There are also many other supply routes that's being used. There are just field roads that are being used to supply Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. But as you can see, the suffocation is happening, and it's going to happen more and more. The front line here is apparently collapsing, and so this definitely doesn't bode well for Ukrainian side. The reason, oh, by the way, and just to explain how it works, the reason it's being holding here in this southern sector is because there is that newly created Azov brigade, which is sort of shadow of real Azov, but nevertheless it managed to attract more motivated soldiers. So as a result, again, the front line is being held by the bodies of those motivated soldiers that die in this third brigade called Azov. For some time it stamps advance, but it doesn't result. It's a strategic dead end for Ukraine, and there is no any kind of Azov here in the northern sector, and that's why you see the front line is collapsing here. And this also ties to what I said, that at this point Ukrainian military is trying to capture people to put in them on the front line, and people obviously, those are not motivated soldiers, they surrender, they leave, they desert, and all of that. And so as a result, you kind of like building castle on the sand, where everything can easily collapse, and you're going to have huge collapse. And so, and more of that is going to be happening just because of the past mistakes that's being done, and those mistakes are not being corrected right now. Ukrainian military and political top is not able to correct those. And from that perspective, that's why they lead Ukraine to eventual some kind of sort of potential disaster. The way the policy that they do in Ukraine right now. This is how it looked on February 13. So as you can see, the southern part more or less holds and even improved here in this area, but the northern, this is a huge blow again. So you can see compare as a huge blow to Ukrainian defenses. So again, this is the same, just more centered on everything. So the northern part and the southern. So as you can see, this is basically, you can call it Bahmut salient, and it's essentially done at this point. Now let's look at central Donbass front line. Things here are without really any changes. Typical Russian attacks out of this Pisky salient that's go not nowhere. Attacks in Marinka that go nowhere. Actually, Ukrainian troops managed to launch small tactical counterattack and push actually Russian troops in Vuhledar to basically recapture some of the lost ground. That ground really doesn't mean much. It's sort of call it bad positions, but nevertheless, that's a small local success. And essentially, as you can see, there's no changes, and that's where probably front line would freeze like this everywhere if there were no Wagner mercenaries. That's really only driving force. Otherwise, it's just going to be global freeze where just mid grinder without really not moving territorially anywhere. And then let's close with the Zaporizhya front line. Since here also for now frozen since early January, there's no any other activities here at this point. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and till next time, bye bye.